and I'm going to welcome everybody to today's meeting and ask Awhina if you would open our proceedings for us today, please.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa. Tui e te rangi e tui honei, tui e te papa e takoto aki nei, tui e te hiringa tangata e rarau mai nei. Tui e ko ngā koro o te wānanga, kia tui haumi e hui e tai ki e nau mai haramai e te iwi ki tēnei o ngā wānanga e pāna ki ngā kaupapa e hāngai ana ki a tātou te aki anu ngā taonga o Kuima o Koroma. Tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Kia ora Awhina. So I'm Philippa Toka from Museums Aotearoa. I'd like to welcome everybody here today. What we're going to do is have a little bit of an introduction of the people who have been involved and are involved in the process of reviewing the Museums Aotearoa Code of Ethics and the discussing the repatriation addendum for Kōiwi Tangata and associated burial Taonga. And as we do that, there's going to be a process to engage with people along the way. And this is just the first of our hui about it with the people in the museum sector in general. So what first we're going to do is introduce the committee members for the Code of Ethics Review Committee. Then we're going to hand over to other people. And I would just ask you all to just mute your speakers, your microphones, unless you're actually speaking. We've got a couple of random noises in the background. And use the chat if you'd like to ask any questions or make any notes. So I will now hand over to, I think I'll start with Awhina, since she was the one who has welcomed us here today. So Awhina, would you like to introduce yourself and then hand over to someone else in the committee?
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ko Awhina tūmi tōku nei ingoa, ko tānu te waka korua hine te pai maunga ko rangi tika i te awa, ko Ngāti Rau Kawatiau ki te tonga te iwi i te taha tōku pāpā, ko tākitimu te waka ko aorangi te maunga, ko rangi tika i te awa, ko Ngāti Hinamanu te iwi, e mihana kia koutou katoa. My name is Awhina Tumi. I'm the Kaitiaki Taonga Māori and Kai Whakaako at the Whanganui Regional Museum. And I've just sort of just barely joined the group yesterday. Tēnā tātou. And was also and then also part of the National Repatriation of Human Remains group. And I'm going to be passing the over to Jenny, who's on my right in the picture. Jenny Harper, tēnā koe. Oh, you're back on mute.
I'm on the board of our Museums Aotearoa now, again, and that's, I'm really pleased that this Code of Ethics is being reviewed. I was certainly involved in leading the group who put it in place 10 or more years ago, 13 years ago, I think. And it's important that it is reviewed. There were areas we didn't have very much expertise in, and it's important that those are now addressed in a better and more full and wholesome way, because we've come a long way in the last 15 years in Aotearoa with a range of different matters that relate to the Code of Ethics and are particular to this part of the world. Anyway, that I was the director of the Christchurch Art Gallery Te Pūnero Waifetu until I'm not very retired.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm sorry we missed that as your screen froze occasionally, but I think we got most of it. Thank you. Shall we hand over to Amber now? Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou I tēnei ahirahi. Ko Amber Aranui ahau, no Ngāti Kahununu me Ngāti Tūwhare Toa o Kōiwi. Kia ora everyone, my name's Amber Aranui. I'm the current project lead for Ngā Kahu, our National Repatriation Project. Prior to that, I was the repatriation researcher for Karanga Aotearoa repatriation program that's based at Te Papa, and I guess I'm the honorary face of this addendum, but it's not just me, there's many of us that have been involved in this, but I'll talk about that later. Kia ora. Oh, I'll pass it on to Victoria.
Kia ora koutou, ko Victoria Eason tōku ingoa. I'm Head of Sector Development, Pau Whakahaere for National Services Te Pairangi at Te Papa Tongarewa. And I've been on the periphery supporting Amber with her mahi with the Ngā Kahu National Repatriation Program. And as a result of that, interested in how we can create more opportunity and awareness within the Code of Ethics framework around the repatriation and care for human remains in museums and cultural institutions around the country. So it's a real privilege to be part of this rōpū that's going to be working on the review, and I'm looking forward to making sure that we get lots of input and comment from across the sector. So kia ora koutou. And I will hand over to Coralie.
Kia ora koutou, ko Coralie O'Hara, tōku ingoa. I'm ko Tuitui Rangahau Repatriation Coordinator and Researcher at Auckland Museum, and my involvement to date has been through the Repatriation Network as Deputy Chair and now the incoming Chair. And I will pass over to Jamie.
Kia ora tātou, ko Jamie Mixka tōku ingoa no Naitahu te iwi. I work at Otago Museum as Assistant Curator Māori, and I also feed into this project through being one of the kaitiaki representatives on the MA board, and also a member of the Repatriation Network. So I'm really interested in this process and how we can incorporate other Indigenous value systems into the MA Code of Ethics. Kia ora. I will pass over to Liz.
Oh, kia ora koutou. I'm Liz Cotton and I am Head of Planning and Operations at Waitangi Treaty Grounds, until last week Head of Human History at Auckland Museum. And I'm on the Museums Aotearoa board and the subcommittee for the Code of Ethics. So we've been talking about reviewing the ethics for quite a while now. So it's absolutely amazing to have this group together. So kia ora and thank you. And at Auckland Museum, I've also worked with Coralie and with Olivia on reviewing the addendum on behalf of Auckland Museum as well. Kia ora. I'm going to pass over. Who else have we got in our... Olivia?
No, we have our newest member of the Code of
Oh,
Ethics.
sorry.
Hanahiva Rose. And
oh, Hanahiva, thank you.
she joined us yesterday, so welcome, Hanahiva.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm a very new member. My name is Hanahiva Rose. I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and Collections at the Govett Brewster Art Gallery in New Plymouth. Before I took up this role in November last year, I was working at Manatū Taonga Ministry for Culture and Heritage as an advisor, primarily working with the Protected Objects Act. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes.
Kia ora, Hanahiva. So that's the people who are bringing together all the thinking which has been going on over many years about the Code of Ethics and about the Repatriation Addendum, which is coming into being. And there's been a huge amount of work going on over many years, as you would imagine. And many of the people who are here on this call today have been involved in this in various ways as well. So what we're really interested in today is just sharing some of the process and some of the thinking, and beginning to have a bit of dialogue, a bit of kōrero about how this will work in practice and where it's going to go from here. So just to start us off with the actual Code of Ethics as it currently is, I'm going to hand back over to Jenny Harper, who was one of the leading people in the last review of the Code of Ethics, and as she mentioned, had been involved with it before that. Jenny, I'm going to let you unmute yourself and take over and tell us a little bit about the background, please. You're still muted, Jenny. You need to click the bottom left.
Two different spots.
No, it's muted again. Just the one button on the bottom left is good.
Right, okay, so is that all right now? Okay, good. I was certainly involved to a greater degree than I remember with the rewriting of the Code of Ethics, such as it is now. And this was at least 10 years ago when we started to review it. And it's been set out in such a way that it was available for governing bodies, for people in councils who managed museums but didn't necessarily know about the ethics aspects of museum and gallery work, and for people who were directors as well as for staff. So governing bodies, managing people in councils, these sorts of people, these sorts of aims. So that's why it's broken into responsibilities of, say, museum and art gallery staff, or responsibilities of governing bodies and relevant local authorities. It was aimed at those people to try and ensure that they knew that they were part of a whole picture which was about museum ethics. Now, various things were really at the top of our minds in those days. There was a lot going on about restitution of Nazi work in Europe, which had been stolen during the Nazi regime. Institution. There was a lot going on about conflicts of interest at different levels, and also we, I guess, this code reflects quite a few of those issues. It's written quite formally, and I think there's a sense in which it ought to be quite formal, because it is a document that we expect people in the museum sector to adhere to, and it's not a casual thing. We also needed to align ourselves as much as we could with ICOM, the International Council of Museums, and just make sure that we were, you know, not too left field, so that this code wasn't part of the bigger picture of museums. Aotearoa is quite left field, actually, and we've done heaps of things well before other countries, and I think it's great that that's happened. Slow though it may be for many people. Anyway, there are a couple of appendices in this version of the Code of Ethics, and rereading the natural history one I thought was quite interesting, as it's touched on a couple of topics that are related to Māori and repatriation and the interest of those things. we hadn't really at that time started repatriating human remains to the degree that has happened in the last 10 years, certainly with places like the British Museum and those sorts of museums which had Maori remains, human remains, I should say, and have subsequently taken steps to repatriate them. And we included these appendices in order to just, I guess, allude to the fact that these were areas that should be of interest to the community in the future. I always regret that we didn't stay together long enough to consider examples of good practice and perhaps bad practice to help elaborate on what the code meant in real life, but that's just a fact. We didn't get on to doing that, and it really would enhance the reading of this particular document. But it needs reviewing, it needs updating, all the in this and other countries as times progress or time passes. Perhaps it's a moot point whether it's progression all the time. We need to update our thinking and our codes and our practices. And I think it's a very good time to do that. And I think we should wish each other good luck in this area. And kia kaha.
Kia ora, Jenny, thank you for that. As you say, it is intended to be a living document, and this review process is intended to engage with people who are particularly interested in ethical questions, but also to look at ways to make this more accessible and more useful. As Jenny mentioned, we would love to add some examples, some case studies, which may help those of you who are working at the coalface rather than us who are sitting in the back rooms to actually apply ethical principles and think about them on a practical basis in the day-to-day work. It's also timely with the development of the Repatriation Addendum. Again, as Jenny mentioned, this is something which has become much more top of mind in the last decade. We did talk about it briefly in the last review, but at that time we're not in a position to really include it without all the work that the Ngā Kahu group has undertaken in the years intervening. So there is a process for this review, and as mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of our hui to talk with members of the sector about it. We will have more, and as we hear what people would like to talk about, we may have quite targeted hui to discuss particular aspects, or we might discuss it with particular groups of interested people, such as the emerging museum professionals. The kaitiaki might have a separate kōrero about it, and we will also invite kind of formal or informal submissions via email. We have until the 12th of October to gather up the thinking and the discussion and the feedback, and our aim is to come back with a revised version by the end of this year. We don't want this to continue too long because we feel that it needs to happen and get out there and be used by people at the coalface as soon as possible. On the other hand, of course, we will be open to reopening the review process at any time that anything needs to be readdressed. So one of the impetuses, I'm not sure if that's a word, but one of the reasons why we're reviewing right at this moment is this wonderful new addendum, the National Repatriation for Kōiwi Tangata and associated burial Taonga within Aotearoa. I hope that those of you who are on this call have had a chance to download it and have a look at it. If you haven't, it is there on the website, and we will make that link. I'll put that link into the chat for you if you haven't already got it. But at this moment, I'm going to hand over to Amber Aranui.
Oh, kia ora no. I guess I'm just going to quickly provide a bit of an outline on how this addendum was developed and I guess what its aims are. So I guess to sort of start off, I had always found that it was strange that we had a government policy that supported the repatriation of Kōiwi tangata Māori and Moriori from overseas institutions, but we never had any kind of policy or guidelines that focused on the return of Kōiwi from a domestic or from an Aotearoa perspective. And so that's just an aside, but I always thought that was strange, that, you know, that there was nothing that supported us doing this mahi nationally. So from there, I was seconded into the Ministry for Culture and Heritage just for about 4 months to undergo a survey of museums to ascertain, I guess, the size and scope of collections across different museums in terms of human remains. So how many institutions within New Zealand held human remains, how many did they hold, and where were they from was the most important thing. And so this survey really came out of Minister Cipollone, who was present at a repatriation back to Rapa Nui. And that really, I don't know if touched her was the right word, but I'm going to say that. It affected her in some way by sort of, for her understanding the fact that actually there was tupuna from the Pacific in museums here in Aotearoa. And so that was quite shocking for her to realise. And so she was sort of started asking questions, right, how many of our Pacifica tupuna are in New Zealand museums? In actual fact, how many human remains do we have? So that was my job, to harass museums across the country. And whether it's by email or phone call, I had many a phone call actually with the smaller museums, which was fantastic. And they're very open about sharing some of their experiences. And so the outcome of that survey, one of the outcomes, was that museums generally felt that there was a need for some direction in terms of the repatriation and care of Kōiwi tangata throughout Aotearoa. And that those guidelines, you know, should be a national guideline, something that we can all look to and follow. Yeah, so that was one of the, I guess, biggest outcomes of that survey. So following then, Minister Cipollone was able to secure some funds through MCH to provide support for a national project, which has been called Ngā Kahu, and that's a national repatriation project. And so I guess the aim of that project is to support museums who are open to repatriation, to actually help them prepare and get ready to return all of those Kōiwi back to their people, whether it be here in Aotearoa or overseas. But also one of the aims of this project was to actually create some national guidelines around repatriation. And so that work actually was done by a large group of people, made up of the New Zealand Repatriation Research Network. And so that network is made up of currently about 18 museums across the country, big and small, regional, who are open to repatriation and feel that it's important mahi that we need to do. So all of those museums were provided with the space to feed into this project, and we had some really great discussions and really good feedback from, you know, the majority of these museums who were involved. We also had some really good feedback from other key people within the museum sector, and we really wanted to get as wide a range of feedback around developing this guideline as possible, because we realised that not everybody would agree with everything that's written down in there, but you know, for us, you've got to start somewhere. So that's where we landed with it. So I guess the aim of this document is to provide museums with those guidelines that they felt they needed. The aim of it also, I guess, is to ensure that we are just as active nationally as we are internationally. And I guess we have that view from the international stage that we are one of those leaders in the repatriation movement. But I think, you know, on a domestic scale, I think we are far behind some of these other countries. And so for me personally, it's a little bit embarrassing when, you know, people look to us for advice around repatriation in that national sense. So I thought we need to fix that. So hence here we are. And I also think it's important for this document to bring New Zealand up to date on issues around repatriation. You know, for me, I see it as it's a new norm for museology. You know, repatriation is just part of museology today, whether we like it or not. I feel it's here to stay for a while. And so I guess we might as well educate ourselves on that fact. And also, I guess, you know, I feel like we really need to practice what we preach. So, yeah. So that's all from me. I think that will do.
Kia ora, Amber. So what we thought we'd do now is sorry about that. I thought I'd unmuted myself, but I must have double clicked. What we thought we'd do as a committee was we'd just ask a few questions, and we want you to use the chat to offer any examples or any answers that you have. I just do note, and I should have noted at the beginning, we are recording this CoE so that we can make some of it, at least if not all of it, available to others who aren't joining us here today. And by using the chat, we can record some of the responses, which will help to inform us as we go through this review process. So I've just added one of the questions in there, and I'm going to hand over to Victoria Essen to just go through some of the questions that we thought we might ask, and invite those of you who are on this call to also add your own questions in via the chat. Victoria.
Kia ora, Philippa, thank you for that. Yeah, so we've got a few questions that we'd like to hear from you about. I would suggest that, you know, if you've got a comment that you'd like to make, please feel free to do that, because, you know, as Philippa said, we're recording, so that'll be a record of your response. But if we move to the next one and you have additional information that you'd like to contribute, then pop that down in the group chat. So the first question that Philippa has posted is, do you and your colleagues ever discuss the current code of ethics? And if you do, in what context? So I'll just give you a little bit of time to think about that, and then please jump in. Even if the answer is no, we don't, then it would be really good to hear that. So if anybody has a response to that, maybe put your hand up as part of the protocols, or just unmute yourself and away you go.
Perhaps I could just mention a couple of other aspects. Somebody asked in a committee meeting yesterday about actual cases for the Code of Ethics, and we have had formally referred to Museums Aotearoa, maybe one case every couple of years where people query whether an institution or an individual has perhaps crossed the line in terms of abiding by the Code of Ethics. And we have referred those to, we don't have a standing committee for the Code of Ethics. What we do have is a committee which is convened to investigate any particular cases that are brought to our attention. Jenny Harper's been on that committee. I see David Butts is on this call and he has assisted us with that as well. So perhaps another thing to think about is whether there are particular cases which are, or particular conundrums which may be addressed by the Code of Ethics or by a process within the Code of Ethics. Yeah, Victoria, did you want to have some other thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I'm just waiting to hear if anybody's got any comments. Liz?
Oh, kia ora. I think my experience at Auckland Museum, and I don't know if this is replicated in the other larger regional and national museums, is that the Code of Ethics was only really known amongst those who work in collections and or who have studied museum practice in some way. And I think that's a real problem. It's not, I mean, this sort of answers question 1 and question 2. It's not part of any formal induction, and I tried to make it part of the induction unsuccessfully so far. I shall hand that over to Coralie. And it's, I think, because people who have studied or worked in museums in the collection areas for a long time tend to know about them, and also in a parallel way about repatriation and ethics around human remains, it's very much seen as, you know, for the museum professional people and not for the marketing team and the digital team and the comms team. And I think that's a really something that Museums Aotearoa really needs to consider. And I'm looking at who's in this call, and I think that really reflects the people who have an interest in this, and that there's a real gap in the bigger museums who have quite a diverse culture and workforce, that it sort of needs to be socialised amongst the whole team, not just the collections areas.
Yeah, I would totoko Liz's comments. I'm Victoria from Auckland Museum. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Victoria.
I think the last time I looked at it was when ICOM came out with their polyphonic definition, and I started reading, just went and read back at it. I think that was the last time that we really discussed it, because I was just like, oh, is it where we're going? And so I was just wanting to see if we were, Museums Aotearoa was going to comment on it. So I think that's the last time, but I totally agree that it seems like it's just for collections people, and we haven't really figured out how to include front of house. And I mean, I'm sure it includes it in there, but it's not like assumed that they just they happen to work at a museum in some aspects, I think, especially in some of our teams. So it feels a little bit siloed, but it could be just our organisation.
Kia ora, thank you, Victoria. Are there any other comments to that first question? Do you or your colleagues ever discuss the Code of Ethics, and in what context? Jane has got a comment, I can see.
Yeah, I was thinking of times when I discussed it with colleagues, and it was often in the context of governance and conflicts of interest at that level. For instance, depending on political alignment of people on the governing body, which is perhaps more in a local authority setting, where there might be disputes, or in the context of sponsorship and the kinds of companies that a museum might be happy or not happy to sponsor with. And I think there's many areas beyond collections that you're absolutely right, where there should be lively discussions about ethical issues. I also just wanted to mention that Victoria Passau mentioned ICOM. they, at their last meeting in September last year, they established a new national committee, international committee, to discuss ethical dilemmas. And so it might be that one of our ICOM members who's unaffiliated to one of the groups might like to hook up with that, so that we can tap into anything that's coming from there. Even though we want to look in a New Zealand context, that doesn't mean to say that there mightn't be insights from overseas that could help us.
Thanks, Jane. Safua has her hand raised now.
Yeah, kia ora koutou and talofa. I also work at Te Papa, but I've just come in from the Pacific, where I was engaging a lot with some of these conversations and debates on repatriation, restitution. Been working with the German Museum Association and looking at ways that, again, while they were setting their guideline and trying to socialize it across different museums in Germany. And also just thinking about the Pacific Island Museum Association and sort of what ethics they have in terms of this area. And so just coming in with, from the other side, if you like, and thinking about who in New Zealand we need to socialize this code with, which communities, collectives, other groups that may not necessarily be able to engage with museums at the moment, but obviously is an issue that register with some of them. And as Amber mentioned, I'm getting a lot of colleagues from Africa who are also reaching out around this area. So it would be good to, you know, see what other kinds of ethics are out there and how we might want to sort of you know, bring those into these conversations. Thank you.
Kia ora, Safua. Thank you for that. And it's interesting to get that international perspective and view as well. As Amber said, there's lots of work that's happening outside of Aotearoa in this area. There have been some great comments in the chat function as well. Kane from the Otago Museum has given us some really good insights to the fact that while they don't necessarily refer to the Code of Ethics as such, a lot of the principles and tenets of it are embedded into the work that they do, particularly in the natural history areas. But it would be great if Afina's responded there to see how we can make it more relevant and connected to their mahi. And also, in response to the second question, which I'll now open up to the broader group, which is just how the participants on this Zoom hui are aware that the Code of Ethics of Professional Practices referred to in any of their museum or galleries policies or procedures, like say induction, which is one that Liz mentioned earlier. It'd be great to know in what way they're used and what the overall awareness of the document is for your organisation. So again, I'll open that up for comments. And again, if you would prefer to leave your comments in the chat section, then please feel free to do so. Anybody got some opening comments there? I'm just aware I can't see everybody on my page, but please feel free to just unmute yourself and it will jump to you, okay?
Probably for me, Philippa. Okay, for me, working in galleries, the main way that it was used was thinking about curators and people on staff collecting art and not collecting in conflict with the gallery. And that was one aspect where the Code of Ethics has been very helpful in pointing out what a conflict is. And we used to start every acquisitions meeting with asking if there were any acquisitions had been made by staff, and you know, and talking basically was that you offered things to the gallery at the price you paid, unless it was turned down by this committee. So, I mean, that's probably something, it won't apply to repatriation or anything like that, but it is something that where this code has been, I think, really useful in helping to sort out various conflicts of interest. And also, I agree with Victoria, the issue of sponsorship and sort of clean companies and companies that you're prepared to be associated with. I mean, we used to have Benson and Hedges and all sorts of alcohol and tobacco companies sponsoring things, and that's gone now. So we do accommodate various ethical considerations, and it's therefore great to be talking further about different ones now, including obviously repatriation, which you've done a lot of work with. 10 years ago, there was a policy at Te Papa and one at the Canterbury Museum, but they weren't on the web yet. So, you know, a lot has happened in that time.
Kia ora, thank you, Jenny. It's great to get the perspective of how the Code of Ethics is used within that art context. There's some great comments that have been posted up in the chat. Again, one from Olivia, which is around the use of ethical language and embedding the Code of Ethics into the ethical language policy. So that's really interesting and an interesting use. But also just iterating again that if your work doesn't specifically connect to an area that relates to the Code of Ethics, then it's unlikely that you will be discussing it and or even know it exists. I can offer that from Te Papa, the Code of Ethics is referred to in our Code of Professional Practice, which is signed by everybody as part of their work agreement, joining the organisation. But it's only referred to as saying, you know, this Code of Professional Practice also incorporates the tenets and ideas as expressed through the museum's Aotearoa Code of Ethics. I once went and asked HR whether they had a copy of the Code of Ethics, so that if interested people could, you know, wanted to have a look, that they could share it, and they didn't. So, I mean, that was some time ago when perhaps people weren't so able to access things online. So it kind of demonstrated that while we had reference to it, we weren't necessarily educating people very well about it. There's a good comment from Jane, which is just around the fact that from her experience as being involved in a governing body, that the Code of Ethics has been helpful. So I'm interested to know if there are any other people here who also hold governance roles who can share their experience of the use of the Code of Ethics from that perspective.
It's very important to introduce your board members to the Code of Ethics as well. The other thing that we did at Christchurch Art Gallery was got it put into every single job for anyone employed in the gallery. abide by or know about, and I think that's helpful too. But I agree with board members, there can be real conflicts of interest, and it's important that they're as much part of the code and understand the code is applying to them as it is for you know, your managers and council and various others.
Yes, after this the last review in 2013, I think it was about 2015, MA held workshops as part of our regional hui, and those workshops just explored what the Code of Ethics covered and encouraged people to have a chat about some scenarios which were actually taken from real situations. And I recall at that time, Auckland Museum said, we'd like to do this with our board. And they actually ran their own workshop with their board members. So I've put up another question, which is a bit further back up the chat now, which was suggested by the committee, which is what kind of structural changes might help to make it more relevant. And also, I would add to that the question about how to socialise it. We talked earlier about the need to do so. So perhaps anybody who might have some suggestions about how to encourage this kind of discussion.
I can just say that Lisa's posted a great comment from the Gilbert Brewster Art Gallery, where she shared that she's engaged with the Code of Ethics, but off her own bat. So it wasn't necessarily something that was encouraged by the gallery, but she did that of her own accord. So I guess building awareness around the fact that it relates to professional practice no matter where you sit within the museum. And Liz has also posted a comment to that regard to say that you know, the Code of Ethics is very broad, and that those responsibilities are right across the museum. So it's interesting that there's a perception that it has a particular relevance to collections, but that in reality it is quite a broad document. So the question that Philippa has raised around the structure is that we're particularly interested to know whether areas where there is a little bit more information, such as within the natural history area, or with a proposal around the repatriation and care of human remains, keen to know from those that are here whether you think that that should be embedded within the body of the document, or whether they're better to sit as appendices to the main document. So again, I'll just open up and let anybody that has a particular comment about that, it would be really great to let us know what you think.
I was going to say, just following on from Liz's comment about how we can't get it into our induction programs. It's like, if we can't get it into the induction program and it only seems to relate to collections, how, yeah, I think that's the problem, is probably need ET buy-in to somebody owns it outside of collections areas.
Cool, thanks Victoria, it's a really good point. Just see that Amber has posted a comment about you know, whether the information should sit as appendices or within the body. Amber said in the main document. And Susan has offered a comment which is just to say that, well, essentially they are in the same place, whether they're an appendix or within the main document.
Can I follow up there, Victoria? It's Shay from Nelson Provincial.
Hi, Shay.
Hello. I have a concern with keeping it in the appendix, is that it may be seen as a Māori problem, and museums hold a variety of Kōiwi. I mean, even medical collections come to mind. I know we don't have a strong presence of medical collections in New Zealand, but there's certainly overseas, pathology collections, anatomy. So I think we need to sort of, embed it in the main body to not differentiate between, the origin and use of those specimens, or those taonga, and some obviously as well.
Thank you. That's great comment, Shay. An interesting point from Jane, which is to suggest that incorporating case studies within each segment, and also with the opportunity to add further links online, would be, in her view, a good suggestion. And Susan just saying, to clarify, I mean, it needs to be in the main text and elaborated on in the addendum, and then a special standalone document.
Yeah, so quite passionate about this.
Yeah, it's interesting. And would you like to make any comments?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to, thank you. So placing it within the main text gives it the importance that we want to place on this kaupapa, on this subject. And like I said before, if it doesn't make the document any shorter by placing it at the end as an appendix, or putting it in the main body where I think it should be. But any type of case studies like Jane and that we're talking about could be placed as an appendix. But something this important, even as Shay was saying, and Susan has already alluded to, needs to be within the main body of the book. Just a little quick shuffle to the, and then put anything additional as an appendix, because that's what the word appendix says to me. It's an additional thing. It's not part of the main. It's just, well, here's something as additional, and we don't want it to be referred to in that sort of way when we're looking at the repatriation of human remains. Anyway, that's me. Kia ora.
They're very good.
Jenny, I think you need to be off mute again. And you're still on mute. I think it's a problem with the double click. Jenny, you're still on mute.
I'll try. Sorry. The appendices are Philippa.
It's very frustrating with the mute coming on and off there, Jenny. So there's lots of diversity of opinion there, and it's really great to have that recorded. Thank you for your views on that. We've got 5 minutes until the end of the hui. Really quickly, we're interested to know whether you've ever had a case in your museum or gallery or cultural institution where you've had to refer to the code of ethics, and how did you find applying it? So this is more around those kind of case studies. Has anybody got anything that they can share with us there? And again, please feel free to add that into the chat. Maybe Philippa, you could kick us off with one of the ones that has happened in the past.
Yes, certainly. Most of the case studies that I've been involved with have involved conflicts of interest of one sort or another. Sometimes it's people who are both governing bodies and management roles, and those kind of roles are in conflict. but more often it's to do with collecting and provenance. Those are the kinds of questions that have been raised, and to do with whether it's appropriate for somebody to be making decisions about acquisitions and collecting when they are themselves personally collecting in that area. And I think probably the Code of Ethics is fairly clear on that, and we've usually been able to make a fairly clear call. Where it gets less clear cut is when we're talking about ideology, and somebody mentioned earlier those kind of conflicts in relation to politics. What's the overall kind of intent of the organisation, and how does that relate to the intent of individuals on the governing body, particularly, as well as on the staff? And I guess that, interestingly, goes back a little bit to the definition debate, and whether museums are there to change lives, change minds, or whether they're there to collect, preserve, protect. So I'd be quite keen to hear from people who would like to open up some of those ideas around where the Code of Ethics intersects with the overall aim and goal and purpose of museums. So that's not quite answering your question, Victoria, but it's opening up another one, which I hope that this review process will begin to talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's a nice big broad area to finish on there, because we're just about up to time. I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up there, just because, so that we are finishing on time, but open the opportunity for anybody who has any further comments to please send them through to, I'm going to volunteer Philippa for that. And just a couple of other things that have come up. You know, Susan makes a really good point about the fact that online delivery actually changes a lot of the kōrero about where things sit or stand, because then it is all one document, and it's just clicking into different areas and places to be able to get further information where you need it. So that's a really good thing to think about. Yeah, really keen to keep hearing from you. There will be further conversations, as Philippa has suggested, and further conversations that drill into particular areas. So yeah, Olivia's made some really good points just right at the end there about some real gaps in the document as it exists now. So we're very keen to make sure that during this review process we have the opportunity to address some of them. So there will be some special interest areas that will be advertised, and opportunities to drill in further in those areas. And I'll hand back over to Philippa for any further comments, and then maybe Awhina to close our hui.
Kia ora, Victoria, and thank you to everybody who has contributed in the chat today, and also with your own comments. And I realise this is very much an opening conversation starter, and there are some really important aspects which we need to drill into a lot more. We will be putting out a program for further consultation, and we would really encourage you to talk to your friends and colleagues about anything that might come to mind about the Code of Ethics, about repatriation, about case studies, and more areas for us to discuss. So thank you to all our contributors. I also especially acknowledge the input that the members of the committee are putting in, especially those who have only just joined us and have already taken on this kaupapa with huge enthusiasm. Really appreciate it. So we will no doubt have more conversations of this kind, and I look forward to them very much. Just ask Awhina to close us off for the day, please.
A tēnā rā tātou katoa. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, tuia ko ngā koro te wānanga kia tīna, tīna, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou.